Hello, thank you for joining us today for the second part of the documentary filmmaking workshop series. My name is Gavin Spores. I'm a film and moving image graduate from Norwich University of the Arts, and I'm a NICO outreach officer there. So if you haven't already checked out the first part, I do recommend that before joining in with this session. So before we kick off here, I'll give you a chance to watch back with the first part of the series, Find a Story, which should be in the links below. Um, and for this session, so the main resource that we're going to use today is a camera. We're going to be looking at a lot of camera work. So that could be in the form of a mobile phone, a tablet, a DSLR, any kind of equipment that you have that can capture footage. So the main 2 points that we're going to be looking at today is first of all looking at how to interview your subject. And then the second part, we're going to be looking at how you're actually going to shoot the interview with your subject there. So these are the two main points that we're going to be looking at today. So it's all focused on production within your documentary projects. So, documentary interviews, the thing that we really need to remember and think about at all times is that documentaries are stories told by people. The thing with documentaries is that you're thinking about, if you compare it to a fiction film, and we have different characters and people, and that helps tell the story that we want to tell. And it's the exact same thing in documentary filmmaking, except instead of fictionalized characters, we have real people. But essentially, the people that you're interviewing within the documentaries, they are your characters who are going to be helping to tell the story. So, how to interview? Here are some points to think about when it comes to the interview itself. So, you got to remember to prepare your questions. Before you start writing a list of questions down, you need to do your background research on relating back to the subjects and the themes of the story that you want to tell, and looking at the background of the person that you're interviewing. How do they relate to the subject at wide and the particular story that you want to tell? So prepare your questions, but also have a good handy list with you with the questions. And when it actually comes to designing the questions themselves, you want to have open-ended questions, and by that I mean with closed-ended questions. That means that the person that you're interviewing, they can only answer with a yes or a no. We don't want that. We want open-ended questions. So it will probably sound like why or what or who or how. So your interview subject doesn't just keep replying with yes or no, because that's not going to add to any interesting story moments. But you want questions that will push them to give you a really nice, big, elaborate, detailed answer. And that's where you're going to get a lot of the content from in your overall documentary. So prepare your questions, be smart about it, and try and design a question so you got your subject to really talk in detail so you get as much content as possible. And with that in mind, you want to create a relaxed atmosphere. This is probably the most important thing about the interview. A lot of the atmosphere, it will come out of your preparation as well. So with the linking back to preparing the questions, once you've got your questions ready, make sure you send a copy of those questions to the person that you're interviewing, so at least they can have some idea of what they're in for, and also they can start preparing some answers in their heads, which is going to help them. But in terms of creating the atmosphere, you need to treat your interview subjects with so much attention and so much respect. So when you're there on set, you really, as you're setting up the equipment, or someone else is setting up the cameras and sounds, or however you're going about your production, what's really good is to talk through everything that you're doing with your interview subject. So as everything's getting set up, explain to them, okay, so we're just setting up now. We're going to go through these list of questions, and just double check that they've had a chance to look through the questions. And it's just about easing them in and making them comfortable. Because if your interview subject isn't comfortable, they're probably not going to give you the detailed answers that you're looking for. And if they're more comfortable, they're going to be more open to giving you more answers and more information, which adds to the story. So you need to create a relaxed atmosphere, and also it's just going to help you as well. If you're, it could be quite tough to deal with a person that you're interviewing who's, very nervous, a little bit erratic. But if the whole atmosphere is calm and if the interviewee is calm, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to conduct the interview. And this is a really important point as well about no interrupting, because one thing that ruins interviews, you can have somebody giving you such a detailed answer. When you're looking back, all you can hear is, yeah, oh, yes. And it will ruin the flow of your interview footage that you got there. But it can seem, even though you want to create an atmosphere where it feels like a natural dialogue with your interviewee, you need to keep silent so you're getting that clear audio. And the best way to help make the atmosphere a little bit more natural than just sitting in silence is always keeping eye contact with your interview subject, because then it keeps, if you're just looking away and sitting in silence, the interview subject thinks that you're not engaged, and it will make them doubt the answers that they're giving is any good. So with your interview, if you're sitting across from them and they're giving you answers, always give them eye contact. And a really great way that's really simple and silent, most importantly of all, is just not, doing some little silent nods, and that just reassures them that they're doing the right thing. But all in all, it's about looking after the interviewee. When you're on a fiction film set, a lot of the attention goes into the cast and the actors in the film. It's the exact same principle within a documentary, where you need to give your interviewee a lot of attention, a lot of respect, and that way they're going to give you a lot more in return as well. So when it comes to shooting the interview, there's a few things to think about, and a lot of it will tie into fiction filmmaking, of course. But it's just some points to really consider, especially in the documentary genre. So, of course, thinking about competition and the rule of thirds. So, if we take this Simpsons interview as a really good example of the rule of thirds, which you can see from the grid put on top there. So it's, as I say, this is exact same as fiction filmmaking, where you want the subject's eyes or face at certain points within the frame, because our eyes as an audience automatically look in these kind of sections. So if you see where the lines are intersecting, that's where you want your subject's eyes to be. So either on the left-hand side of the frame where Matt is in that frame, or the right-hand side where it's just lit, if you see the intersection just up from Homer's arms there. Or you can have them slap bang in the middle, and that's absolutely fine as well. But you want to use your left, your centre, or your right thirds of the frame to position your interview subject. And that way, the audience's eyes will automatically go where you want them to look. And your positioning of the interview subject is important, but also you need to think about where they're looking as well, and think about their eye line. So this is a really good example of how to have a really good setup for a documentary interview. So you can see there we've got the interviewee on the left-hand side of the frame, and directly in front of them is the person conducting the interview, which is probably going to be you. But you can see where the cameras are positioned. They're very close to the person conducting the interview. And even with a 2-camera setup that they got there, they're both positioned on one side. So for those who are looking to get a bit ambitious with the project and they're using 2 cameras, you still want them both on the one side. So when you're editing later, it makes sense. But the takeaway from getting the subject's eye line is that you want the camera positioned quite close to you. Whether you're shooting from the right or the left, you want it quite close to you. And that way, the eye line it looks like it's directly at the camera, but it isn't quite focused directly into the audience's eyes, because there's a bit of a line there where if somebody is staring right at you for a long time, it can get a little bit unnerving. But if you have it where it's just to the side of the lens or just above, then you still got that connection, but it's not quite creepy there. And another thing to think about is background and location, especially if you're filming in your homes. You might not want, personal items and things like that in the background, but it also thinking about how it looks on camera as well. So the background in the bottom image there, that might look a little bit clustered and a little bit too much going on, because what you don't want is an explosion of color behind the interview subject, because it's going to be too distracting for the audience watching. You want a nice clean background, so the focus is still on the interviewee that you're interviewing. But if we look at the Matt Groening interview at the top there, I mean, yes, we've got some colour in the background, but it's not too distracting from Matt himself. But they've also been clever and had something in the background that actually relates to the subject. So Matt Groening being the creator of The Simpsons, we've got some character cutouts from The Simpsons show in the background there to remind the audience, exactly what they're watching and what the subject is about. But even though we've got a bit of colour there with the oranges, the blues and the yellows, it isn't too distracting from Matt himself. And last and not least, don't forget B-roll footage. When it comes to editing everything at the end, it's not just going to be one long unbroken interview clip. You want to make it exciting, and you want to be able to play with the pacing of your interview by having other footage cut in between the interview that you've conducted and shot. And you could do a number of things with the B-roll footage, but the main thing is that the footage that you're playing over the top of the interview, actually has relevance to what they're talking about. So say if we go back to the Simpsons interview again, say if Matt is talking about the production process of how they made The Simpsons, you might play clips over him talking about the process of making it with clips of the animators actually creating a Simpsons episode. So the constant changing of clips keeps things exciting, but it's still relevant to the story that you're telling. But the main takeaway with shooting a documentary is exactly the same as fiction filmmaking. You're using the camera to best tell the story. So when it comes to the thirds, if you're having the interviewee in the left or the middle of the frame or the right of frame, ask yourselves, why are you having the interviewee in that particular area of the frame? Would it be more powerful if they're at the center of the frame, or would it make more sense to the story if they're on the left of the frame? And it's the same with the backgrounds that you're going to be making or the B-roll that you're going to be shooting. It's all in service of the story that you're telling. So always ask yourselves with every decision that you're making, why are you doing that? So going back to, these are really good examples of everything that we talked about. So we can see in these frames that you've seen before earlier in the presentation that they all stick to a rule of thirds. So we've got left of frame, we've got the center frame, and we've got the right of frame. And we can also see with the eye lines as well. Some of them may be some of them are a little bit further away from the camera than others, but they're still, we can still see the eyes, which is the really important thing here. And you can see, that you can play around, like the image on the left, that's quite close to the camera, it's a little bit more personable. The center frame is a little bit further back, but the centralized position there really helps tell the story, especially when you think of the context of that particular documentary, which is the act of killing, if you haven't seen that yet. And then on the right-hand side is the behind the scenes of The Martian, I believe it is. And it's not quite as close up as the first image, but the framing there and the eye line really helps engage with that person. So play around and see what works for you and what works for your story, most importantly. So shooting with mobile devices, yes, if you've got your tablet or your mobile phone, you've got a built-in camera app. But there are so many applications and pieces of software out there that essentially unlocks the features that your device can do. So if we take this for example, so this is Mavis Pro, and it is on Apple devices only. So you can download this for free onto your iPhone or your iPad or whichever Apple device that you use. And it unlocks so many features, and it just gives you much more creative control when you're shooting. And there is an Android version of this, so we've just got a link down below. And this is Cinema LV Lite on the Android store. And again, it's completely free to get started with it, and it does the same as Mavis Pro, where it gives you so much more creative control within the camera app that you use on your mobile device. And you can just see a little breakdown here from the Mavis Pro app, where it shows you your audio meters. You get a nice big viewfinder, and there's all sorts of different controls with your depth of field, your exposure, and even like color and waveforms. So it has some really basic features, and you can go really advanced. And essentially, this app is designed to replace a whole £1,000 DSLR. So this is so all the examples I'm going to use today are going to be from the Mavis Pro app. But as I say, for Android users, this is very similar. And there are a few things that I really want to focus on when you go out to shoot, which is going to be your composition. So setting up the frame, the positioning of the camera and your subject, and also with using these apps, your depth of field and your exposure as well. So as you can see here, this is the kind of thing that you're going to see when you're booting up the app and recording. So the audio meter's going up. It's a bit quiet for what we want. Really, with audio, you want to hit between the -12 and the -6 decibels there. So the first feature to look at is the exposure. So we've got this little wheel on the left-hand side there, which you can see scrolling through, which is on the left-hand side of the viewfinder. And obviously with exposure, just like any other cameras that you use, it's all about the amount of light that you're letting in. So if you're in a bit of a dark room, you might want to let a little bit more light in so your image gets a little bit brighter. And you can see with the exposure wheel used, it's so easy to use. You're just scrolling up and down, but you can see your relation to the ISO on the left hand side of the whole app there changing as the wheel changes. And usually the rule with the ISO is that you don't want it higher than 800 usually, but that really applies to DSLR cameras. With mobile devices, it's a little bit different, so it might go a bit higher than 800 ISO. But really, to avoid all the complications of ISOs, just try and shoot in a room that is quite bright anyway. And then if you need to, you just lower the ISO and make your screen a bit darker using the wheel. It's a lot better than overexposing, like you can see when the ISO is a bit too high and it gets really overblown with the whiteness. We don't want that. But again, like everything, just play around and see what works, see what doesn't work, and play around and see what looks good. And the other thing to think about is the depth of field. Now, this will probably mostly apply to your B-roll footage. So in order to really get a depth of field and make the foreground or the background blurry and focus on a particular object is when you're really close to it. So unlike the previous slides where you see the interview subject themselves, because of where they're positioned away from the camera, you're not going to be able to play around with the depth of field so much. But for the B-roll footage, if you want to play around with nice creative looking shots, you might play around with your depth of field there. So as you can see with the Apple, it's very similar to playing with your exposure. So you've got this wheel at the right hand side of the viewfinder, and that will play around with the camera and where it focuses. So we go from the background being blurry and the apple in focus to pushing back where the whole frame is blurry. And usually, the closer you get to an object, the bigger the depth of field will be. So again, it's just about playing around, experimenting, see what works, and see what looks good. But again, like we've talked about before, if you're doing this nice depth of field shots, why does it add anything to the story that you're telling? So those are just a few pointers in shooting with different applications, but also how to shoot theoretically your interviews and shooting your documentaries as a whole. Thank you for joining us today. As always, if you have any questions or queries, do email us at art@takeaplace.ac.uk. And we would love to see your work. If you're really into your behind the scenes shots, if you want to show off any work in progress with your shoots, we've got our Twitter and Instagram handles at the bottom there. So we would love to see some of your work. And it would be great to see you for the next part, the final part in our documentary filmmaking series, where we'll be looking at editing all your footage together. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.